There are a couple different ways I want to talk about that we interface with the issue of gender violence and the victims of that violence that tell a different story to them and frankly to us, that speak a different narrative and a different language from that of empathy, from that of compassion, from that of connection, from that of heart. It speaks, frankly, an opposite story to that. It's a national story. A young woman's a first-year student in college. She comes from a place where her values are such that she doesn't believe in sex before marriage. During the course of her first semester, she's out with a couple of classmates, a couple of guys that she feels are trustworthy. They're part of her peer group. During the course of the night, she begins to lose track of how much she's drinking. 6, 7 vodka, raspberry shots, whatever the case. And by some point, she's sort of stumbling around. It's time for her to go. One of her companions, if you will, helps her stumble back to where she thinks is her home. But where he and his companion brought her back to was one of their apartments. And through the course of being in and out of consciousness, realizing that at some point she's laying down with 2 men that she went out with early in the evening and felt like she could trust on top of her. At some point, she's starting to get sick. So they take her into the bathroom. And what happens next is one of those individuals, one of these guys, penetrates her from behind as she is leaned over her sink, the sink, vomiting. This is her first experience with intercourse, and it's rape. Another story, this isn't a national one, but it may be recognizable. It's a young woman, a girl that's just into her teens, that's part of an athletic program with an iconic coach. Though early on in her experience with this coach, he's been molesting her. She goes to adults that she trusts to talk to them about what's going on. What she gets in return is doubt and silence from the people that she's entrusting herself to, that she needs as a young girl. And so subsequent to that, he continues on with the abuse. But she's not alone in her community. There are other young women that are experiencing the same thing. But over the course of several decades, she's living with the pain of this experience and the silence of the community that she lives in, because this is the behavior that's well known by members of the community. But that community's identity is invested in the success that this particular coach was bringing through wins. But at what cost? The young woman who was a first-year student in college, the next day, one of the guys that assaulted her called her on the phone. Said, "Are you okay?" It's like, I don't know. Why was there blood in my underwear from last night? What happened? Do you want to talk about it? So she goes to meet him. At that point, he's there to confess to her that, in fact, he raped her. He says, "I raped you." But the other guy was there as well. And he bullies into the story. He says, No. We had a 3-way. It was great. And so through that doubt, ultimately she finds the courage to step forward and seek some type of accountability for those guys who assaulted her. But the school, at that point, had decided that everyone was too drunk. It couldn't be determined whether or not consent was given in that situation. And so, like the previous story, this is a young woman who, through her victimization, sought some type of empathy, some type of a sense of recaptured, perhaps, safety, some accountability for what was done to her, but didn't find it. And I guess one of the things I want to talk about is how does something like that happen? If that's a story that doesn't sound unfamiliar to you, and I don't think it does, why is that? Because at the end of the day, I don't think there's anyone in this space or who may hear the sound of my voice going forward that would profess to condone that type of behavior, that would condone sexual assault, that would condone rape, that would condone child molestation. Yet somehow these crimes continue to be among the most underreported crimes, violent crimes that we have in the culture. And if part of what we're about is showing up for one another and connecting to one another, then do we have a responsibility to ask ourselves, why is that? And what is our responsibility to it? And how does it happen? Judith Herman, in her landmark book, talked about safety and disconnection, and just what we crave and what we need as human beings as it relates to safety, particularly as victims, survivors of trauma, and what we need as it relates to connection and the sense of disconnection that we feel as victims of trauma, rejected, cast out. At the end of the day, she talks about the cries, right? Ones that come from deep within our histories as young people, as children, right? Going unanswered and feeling completely alone and abandoned within that. Well, there are ways in which we can respond to and create cultures within our communities that deliver a message about whether or not those cries are going to be answered, either beforehand or after a traumatic event. Think about this for a second. Think about the idea of what are some of the questions we ask, particularly of women who are the victims of assault. What were you drinking? Were you drinking? Why were you drinking so much? Did you go out by yourself? Why were you by yourself? Why were you there? Did you make eye contact? Were you flirting? What time did you go back to her place? Why were you there so late? What did you expect to happen? Sort of a litany of contempt and blame and shaming. And the same is true for men who are victims of crimes in ways in which they are deemed to behave in a feminine way. Think about the story last year of an NFL player who leaves his team after being bullied and picked on and decides the way he's going to handle it after trying to fit in for such a long period of time is he's going to seek some type of assistance, mental health assistance outside of it. But that response was considered too unmanly, too feminine at the end of the day. And so what you heard was from his former teammates, from members of his community, from members of the media, were the idea that he was responsible for what it was that happened to him. He didn't act in a manly enough way. And so think about how often we interface with these ideas, this language, this sense of contempt that we have for what's feminine in the culture. and how often we're able to make a choice about how we're going to behave in response to it. And how often that choice for us is fearful for us, because we're stepping into a space where we may consider or be the recipients of the type of blowback that we don't feel like we can handle, that's going to put us outside of what is acceptable within our peer group. And whether or not that's good enough. That's good enough for us as a community. Whether or not that's the way in which we want to show up for one another around an issue where the silencing and the complicity and the policing around behaviors is part of what's such a big part of this problem. And I'll leave you with this piece. There were a couple of quotes, and one of them I saw from a poet that related to the door. And the line was, "The door has always been there to frighten you and to invite you." And the other line is from the recently late Maya Angelou, and it was attributed to her. And that quote was, "As you rise, you should lift." And I think about how those two quotes can connect to one another. And the connection comes from us stepping into, leaning into what's fearful to us, and the way in which we can show up for one another, to walk hand in hand, leaning into those fears on behalf of one another. Thank you.